Hello and welcome to our final topic of AMP1, and that is the embryological story of how the parasympathetic and sympathetic, or the autonomic nervous system, uh, develops within the fetus. And this becomes important because I think it clears up a lot of what we just got done looking at within the autonomic nervous system. But this also sets you up for understanding why in the cardiovascular system things are regulated the way that they are. Why in the urinary system sympathetic versus parasympathetic has control. Um, when we look at blood flow, when we look at respiratory rates and respiratory system, why are certain um, factors, why are certain physiological responses regulated by sympathetic and not parasympathetic, or vice versa? So this final look at the nervous system from an embryological standpoint is going to tie together a lot of the things that we've looked at so far in AMP1, and it's going to set you up for really, hopefully, clear understanding as you start journeying through AMP2 and moving through the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system and the digestive system and the urinary system and the endocrine system and the reproductive system, and you go through all of those systems. So with that said, let's go ahead and jump into this. The basic embryo plan, and this is a human embryo that you're looking at right there. All right, we don't look much different than a fish or a bird or a reptile or other mammals or anything else when we are at this stage of development, but with a very simple understanding of the organization of the embryo, we will have a much better understanding of the autonomic nervous system overall. And specifically, what I want to do is, so this is a cartoon version of this, and what we've done is we've done a oblique section, right, through the embryo, exposing kind of the inside organization overall with this embryo. And so, what are some of the things that we end up seeing within the embryo? Well, let's take a look at that. All right. So, the first thing that we see, all right, is this structure right there. All right, and what that is what we define as being a suspended gut tube. Right? In other words, this is what will develop into the digestive system, and it is suspended. It's being supported by this ligament that you see right here. All right? And because of this overall organization, we refer to the body plan as a tube within a tube. And so here's one tube, here's the second tube. Right? So really our digestive system is a tube found inside of another tube. Right? And that's going to be important as you move into AMP2. The next thing that we see here are these two humps, one there and one there. This is what develops into what we define as being the urogenital ridges. Right? In other words, this is kind of where the kidneys are going to be developing. All right, what we call the retroperitoneal cavity. And of course, from the kidneys will come the ureters and the bladder and the urethra. All right, we also find developing in here reproductive structures. Will be associated with this area as well. Then we've got the areas that are right back here. Right, and there's two of those, right here and right here. We refer to those as somites. We refer to those as somites. And here's the key thing to remember about these. We're looking at one right here, but these are multiple, so they're stacked, and they run all the way up and all the way down the fetal body. Right? And they do that on both sides. And so this side would run all the way up on this side and would run all the way up on that side. In fact, if you look right here, you see these lines coming in right here and these lines coming in right there. They are indicating somites, these segmented blocks. And you're gonna start hearing this term mesoderm. All right, we talked a little bit about the mesoderm during connective tissue. All right, well, this is where the mesoderm is generated from within these somites. And so this is what the mesoderm is going to give rise to the dermis, skeletal muscle, cartilage, tendons, vertebrae, all right, as well as other aspects of the skeletal system, all right, other connective tissues. All right, and so you can actually see these blocks running up and down from head to tail down the developing embryo. All right, and then the last area that we've got, or next to the last area that we've got, is this area right there, right? And that is the neural tube. And within the neural tube, we've got three structures. We've got what we call a neural crest, and we're going to talk more about that and why that's important. We have a notochord, right? And we're also going to have blood vessels within this area. All right. And then the only other thing that we really need to kind of focus on right now is this area right here, and this is where we actually have pharyngeal pouches. Right, so in this area right here, we have what we define as being pharyngeal pouches. Right? They're gills, essentially, right? But they are gills that will develop into the pharynx and the larynx of the developing embryo and fetus. Right? I do want to draw your attention to this area right here. See this hollowed area? That is the ventral cavity. Notice back here, there is no cavity. Remember what I said. There is no dorsal cavity. The dorsal cavity does not exist. And that's exactly what you're seeing right here. You can see very clearly in this very early embryo, right, you can see the ventral cavity. There is no dorsal cavity. Right? It does not exist. And so if you ever need proof that the dorsal cavity doesn't exist, there it is right there. All right, there it is right there. Now, we can take this. What I basically did was I took this region right here, right, and I kind of blew that up. So we can kind of look at this a little bit more in detail. All right, so once again, this guy right here, right, that is the suspended gut tube. All right, once again, all right. Then right here, right, you have those urogenital ridges that will develop into the urinary system and the reproductive systems. Right up here that I have now circled, right, these are the somites. Right, so this whole thing right here is the somite. Right, and notice that there are three distinct areas to the somite. Right? You've got this yellow region. Right? You got this yellow region, which is what we identify as being the sclerodome. The sclerotome. Right? And it's the sclerotome that will basically develop into the vertebrae and the ribs that will protect the developing spinal cord, which is going to be right over here. Right? So this sclerotome develops into the ribs and the vertebrae. Then we've got dermatome, which is the peach color. Right? We got the peachy color right there. So in peach, we have the dermatome. And the dermatome is what's going to give rise to the integumentary system. Right? So this is going to give rise to the integumentary system, the dermis and the epidermis and the hypodermis. Right? So that's the peach. And then we've got in the purple and the red, in the purple and red, both of these areas right here, this is what we call the myotome. Right? And the myotome is what's going to form the muscle. Right? The red area that you see here forms the muscles of the ventral cavity and the lateral cavity. Right? So in red, we've got muscles of the ventral cavity, right, and the lateral muscles as well. Right? Think about all the muscles that we learned, as well as the muscles of the limb. Right? And in purple, right, and by the way, we refer to that as the hypomere. And so the red is the hypomere. Right? And then in purple that you're looking at right there, that is the epimere. And the epimere is basically the muscles of the back. Right? They are the muscles of the back. And so they are the extensors, basically. Right? So muscles of the back, muscles of the neck. Then you get the neural tube. Right? So you get the crest cells. Right? Hold on one second. You get the neural tube. Right? So you get the crest cells. Right? And these are basically going to be forming the ectoderm, which includes cartilage and bone of the face, teeth, your thymus and your thymic cells, melanocytes, and it is within the neural crest cells that will be located in this area where we have the parasympathetic nervous system. So this is where the parasympathetic nervous system is going to develop. All right. Down here, you have what we call a notochord. And then here you have the neural tube. And it's the neural tube that becomes the brain and the spinal cord. Right, so once again, we have neural crest cells, which are right here. We have a notochord, which is right there. Right, and we have a neural tube, which becomes the brain and the spinal cord. Right, so that's your overall organization of the fetus. Right? And again, I will point out right here, you've got the ventral cavity. There is no cavity back here. Right? No cavity exists. None. Right? We can see it. Right? There is nothing here. So, let me go ahead and continue along with this. All right. So, what is this showing here? Well, this is showing cells within the somite. Right? Remember where the somite is. Right? This is the somite right here. All right. And of course, remember you've got your cells of the sclerotome. You have cells of the dermatome, and you have cells of the myotome, right, that are situated in this area. And these cells are going to start migrating out, forming those various structures that we already talked about. Right? So remember, we said that the sclerotome becomes the ribs and the vertebrae. And so guess what? They migrate towards this neural tube so they can become the ribs and the vertebrae that will surround the spinal cord, okay, and eventually the brain. Right? The dermatome, we know, becomes the integumentary system. And so it makes sense that these cells migrate outward. Right? And you can see that. These cells are going to migrate outward and start differentiating to become the epidermis and the dermis and the hypodermis. And then the myotome, right, which really focuses on myo, you know, is muscular. Right? And so the red cells, as we already talked about, right, are going to move lateral and ventral. Right? So they're going to form the ridges of muscle that make up the sides of the muscle. So your latissimus dorsi or dorsi, your lateral obliques, your transverse obliques, your rectus abdominis, right? And then the additional layers of muscles that are in there as well. And the epimere, up here in the purple, right, they migrate towards the back. So they are developing into muscles of the back. Right? Now remember, this migration of these somatic cells is happening all along from head all the way down to the tail. It's happening from head all the way down to the tail. So you're just looking at one somite, but remember, these are stacked. Right? These are stacked. Right? And so you can see that migration. Right? You can see that migration. By the way, you also see some of these cells here of the hypomere. Right? Remember, this is the hypomere right here. Right? These tend to move so that way they're starting to form the muscles that are going to be in and around the urinary system, the digestive system, the reproductive system. Right? So you can really start to see, right? And this is, by the way, what it looks like kind of when it begins to develop. And so look at right here in the yellow. Right? In the yellow, look, here's the body, right, of the vertebrae. Here's the vertebral arches of the vertebrae. Here's the processes and the ribs of the vertebrae. Right? Here's in the pink up here, right, there's the skin beginning to develop. Right? Here's the epimere and the epaxial muscles developing over here that are now the extensors of the back. Right? And then in the red, you see the hypomeres or the hypaxial muscles, right, that are now developing into the vertebral muscles of the back, right, and the 4 layers of the ventral wall, right, and the ventricular muscles. You're starting to see that right there. There's your rectus abdominis muscles. All right, here's your transverse muscles, your lateral muscles. And so you're starting to see how that body plan is now starting to come together that originated from over here with the somite. Right? Think back. This is kind of putting everything you've learned together all throughout A&P1. This is putting it all together for you into a nice, neat little package, if you want to think about that. All right. So what about the nervous system? Right? What about the nervous system? Well, let's look at the development of the nervous system. Right? And how does this all relate to what we just kind of went over with our somites? So we have some dorsal blood vessels. All right, we have some dorsal blood vessels, and you saw these in the previous images as well. Right, this would be the dorsal blood vessels here. These would be the veins that are over here. All right, and by the way, if I keep going back, all right, they're there as well. These are the dorsal arteries and the dorsal veins right there. And so this is not new. Right? These have kind of been with us. Right? I just haven't drawn attention to them. But notice that there are three branches of these dorsal arteries. Right? One branch is feeding right here the urogenital ridge. Right? One of these branches is going into each and every somite, all the way up to the head, all the way down to the tail. Right? And then the third branch is extending down into the gut tube. Right? Down into the gut tube, right here. Right? Surrounding up here, these cells that you see up here that are blue, light blue, and yellow that I've now outlined in purple, they are the neural crest cells. And they're going to be important for us to kind of keep in mind as we progress, because watch, if I click, all right, notice these yellow cells, when we look at this picture over here, they've migrated, and they've migrated into three distinct areas. I'm going to change my color here. I'm going to go to, let's go to cyan. All right. So notice that they've migrated into three very distinct areas. All right, one here, there's some here, and then there's another couple that are down here. All right. What they've done is these yellow cells of the neural tube. These yellow cells of the neural tube that have left the region of the neural tube and have migrated out, those cells that are in yellow are following smooth muscle in blood vessels. These yellow cells here are actually following the development of blood vessels and smooth muscle within the gut tube as well. So it's seeking out these areas of blood vessels. And by the way, blood vessels also contain smooth muscle, and the smooth muscle that is lining the gut tube. And what they will create, what these yellow cells will create, get ready for this, they will create the ganglion that we see within the peripheral nervous system. Remember, we've saw plenty of ganglion within the autonomic nervous system. These are the cells that are now, we can see them, that are going to create them. These cells up here that have remained steady, they stay close to the neural tube, and they're going to form the dorsal root ganglion, or the spinal ganglion that are associated with the nervous system. We learned about them in lab. All right. These cells that are in yellow, all right, if you have not caught on yet, those cells that are in yellow are the sympathetic trunk ganglion. We talked about them in lab. We learned about them. There they are. They used to be up here, and they originated from over here. All right. So what has happened here is basically these arterioles that migrated out, all right, now start to attract the neural crest cells that are close by the neural tube to relocate. And now we start to see that overall development of that autonomic nervous system begin to take fold. All right, they begin to take fold. The green that you see there, all right, that there becomes basically, as I think I've already mentioned, the smooth muscle of the gut tube and the kidney vessels. Right, so in A&P2, you're going to learn about the superior mesenteric, the celiac, the inferior mesenteric, the aorta, and the renal arteries. There is the sympathetic trunk ganglion of the peripheral nervous system. There are the cells that are going to be driving that development. And then the blue is the smooth muscle of the gut tube. All right, now I will mention, all right, smooth muscle of the gut tube, that is parasympathetic. Smooth muscle up here of the arteries and the veins, that is sympathetic. Right? And of course, this we know is definitely sympathetic up here. So here is your parasympathetic nervous system beginning to take root. Here is your sympathetic and your sympathetic. Right? Think about what parasympathetic regulates. Right? Parasympathetic is your rest and relaxation. It does regulate the smooth muscle of the digestive tract, right? As well as a couple other things that we will also be taking a look at. All right. In this view here, we see that I've highlighted some purple cells. All right, these are what we call the neural tube ventral cells. All right, and those neural tube ventral cells are going to be responsible for the development of the various the specific organization within the spinal cord and the brain. And so where do we go from here? Well, from here, we see the development of these neural pathways. The cells are in place. And these cells got in place because they were seeking out smooth muscle. Now what we have to do is we actually have to have the nerve fibers follow. We have to have those nerve fibers follow those neural crest cells to where they migrated to. And so this is actually a little video that you're going to see here. And I'm going to kind of talk you through this. So you're going to see some blue lines that are going to pop up here in a few seconds. All right. And there's those blue lines. And so those blue lines are the somatic sensory neurons. Those blue lines are the somatic sensory neurons. And they extend from the dorsal root ganglion into the somites. And as you will see here in a couple minutes, they will also go down into the central neural tube. All right. These are the neurons that are going to be following smooth muscle of the blood vessels to the skin and to the muscles. All right. And so they have a sensory function. Now, these green lines that you see come in here, they also originate from the dorsal root ganglion. All right, let me make this clear. All right, what you're looking at right here, all right, that is the dorsal root ganglion. All right. Those green lines that you see that just came in, all right, they're going to go to the gut tube. And so this is a visceral sensory neuron. Right? These are visceral sensory neurons. Remember, we've got a tube within a tube system. Right? And that sensory information from both tubes are needed to be gathered to go back to the central nervous system. And so that's what you're seeing there. Right? Those blue lines are doing sensory information from the skin. Right? And the outer tube, the green lines, is doing sensory information from the inner tube, right? From the inner tube. And then these yellow pathways that you see just popped up on the screen, right? They are your sympathetic post-ganglion neurons that are going to somatic vessels or vessels within the body. All right? And that is also coming off of the sympathetic trunk. They are coming off of the sympathetic trunk. And then notice more yellow lines just kind of popped in here. All right, those more yellow lines are sympathetic postganglion neurons to the gut and the mesentery, all right, vessels of the sympathetic trunk. All right, vessels because it is sympathetic. And so this is your development of your sympathetic nervous system. So your yellow is your sympathetic postganglion neurons. All right, think back to your sympathetic arrangement. All right, your sympathetic postganglion neurons to vessels within the body and vessels within the gut. All right. Those that are the parasympathetic postganglion neurons go into the gut smooth muscle. And so you're going to see that pop up here pretty soon as well. If I remember correctly. All right, you should be able to see that come up here pretty soon. But you're also going to have those sympathetic postganglion neurons that are going to go into the gut's smooth muscle, not the vessels, but the smooth muscle specifically. All right. And then you've got the neural tube ventral cells, which are the green. Right? You see that back up in the within the spinal cord. Right. And that is your sympathetic preganglion. That is your sympathetic preganglion. Right. And so that's only in T1 through T12. Right. So think about that overall arrangement from the last PowerPoint. Your sympathetic, your parasympathetic, there you go right there. Your parasympathetic preganglion neurons, which are in S1 to S3. All right, S1 to S3, as well as within the cervical. All right, they go into the gut muscle. Right, they go into the gut muscle, and you're going to see that come up here pretty soon as well. All right, you're going to see another set of green lines coming in for that. I might be a little bit ahead of this visualization. So we're going to give this a few seconds to catch up. Eventually, there we go, right there. And so that second green line that just came in, that you see that's right there, right, that is your parasympathetic. Right, that is your parasympathetic preganglion neurons that are going to the gut smooth muscle. Right, so your sympathetic was on this side. Your parasympathetic green line was on that side. And then the red lines that you saw that just come in there, they are your somatic motor neurons. And that's what's going to the skeletal muscle within the somites. Right, so your epaxial and your hypaxial muscles, right? Muscles of the back, muscles everywhere else in the body. Right? So that's your somatic regulation. So think about what you just saw here. You have sympathetic development, you have parasympathetic development, you have sympathetic development, you have sympathetic development, and you've got somatic development. All right? Everything that we just went over within the autonomic nervous system lecture video, you've now seen play out in development, right, through this animation. Right, through this animation. And I'm just trying to see how much I think the video is done. So let me go ahead and click. All right, so let's kind of look at the big picture here. All right, clues to sympathetic and parasympathetic in the developing fetus. Right? What are you looking at here? Well, here's what we know. Right? We know that the sympathetic has more regulation over cardiovascular and its smooth muscle. All right. So when we talk about cardiovascular, we're not talking about the heart. We're talking about blood vessels, right? Arteries and veins. And we know that the sympathetic nervous system regulates that, right? And more specifically, the smooth muscle that's within those arteries and the veins. We also know, right, that the parasympathetic has more regulation over smooth muscle within the digestive system. So what? What's the big deal? Well, let's look at this a little bit more. All right. The umbilical cord within the fetus. Here's the umbilical cord right down here. Right? Here's the umbilical cord. All right. The umbilical cord within the fetus does not start out as an umbilical cord. It starts out as a yolk sac. Right? And that yolk sac is actually an extension of the gut tube. Right? So here's your gut tube right here. Attached to this gut tube is a yolk sac, and that yolk sac is what's providing nourishment to the developing fetus. Right? And so it's an extension of the gut tube, and it's a source of all blood vessel formation. Right? It's a source of all blood vessel formation. Right? And so let's look at why that is. By the way, it also creates what we call a heart tube as well. Right? Here's the heart tube right here. All right. And so that umbilical cord starts out as a yolk sac, and it's the umbilical cord. All right. It's the umbilical cord that will be the generator of all blood vessels within the body, as well as the formation of the heart tube. All right. The postganglion cells seek out blood vessels. Remember, we talked about that. Right? They're seeking out smooth muscle to be able to develop the umbilical cord to deliver the nutrients. And so those postganglion cells that we saw migrate away from the neural tube begin to seek out the smooth muscle that's going to be associated with the yolk sac to begin to develop the umbilical cord. Well, that regulation, that stimulation, is coming from T1 through T12, or otherwise the thoracolumbar region. And we know that that's sympathetic regulation. And so what initiates that conversion going from the yolk sac into an umbilical cord is your sympathetic nervous system. And we don't lose that. All blood vessels are under the control of the sympathetic nervous system, because in the developing fetus, there are the nerves that are closest to the developing umbilical cord. Location, location, location. All right? The stomach is much slower to develop within the fetus, which is why we now have to rely on the umbilical cord to deliver all of those nutrients. Right? And so it's got to wait on the development of the sympathetic nervous system to form the umbilical cord to be able to supply the nutrients to the gut tube to begin to differentiate. Right? Remember those preganglion cells that migrated their way down into that gut tube? They were parasympathetic. Right? Why were they parasympathetic? Because they were the cells that were there. There are the cells that migrated into that area. Right? They started here and here. Right? Look, they started here and here. And so the sympathetic nervous, or the parasympathetic nervous system, is focused on the gut because there are the cells that are closest to the gut. Right? They focus on the respiratory system and the pharynx and the heart because that's what was closest. Our reproductive smooth muscle is under the direction of parasympathetic because they were the closest cells to that area. All right. Is that all kind of making sense? All right. They develop to meet in the middle, this way and this way, forming the complete digestive system. So look, these guys are innervating up here, these guys are innervating down there, and they're meeting in the middle, which is where that stomach is. And so parasympathetic is regulating those because that's what cells were the closest. The heart, just by default, is closer to the head than what it is anything else. And so the heart falls under, by location, falls under the jurisdiction of the parasympathetic. And so that cranial sacral development happens here and here under parasympathetic because they were the cells, they were the neural crest cells that migrated out to that area. And if we kind of relate going from here to here, which is what you saw, right? A couple key takeaways from this. One, sympathetic is widespread because blood vessels are widespread. Sympathetic has such wide regulatory mechanisms and control because they first were involved in the development of the smooth muscle lining the arteries and the veins. Sympathetic is widespread because blood vessels are widespread. Parasympathetic is more limited because the gut tube is much more limited in scope. The urogenital ridges are much more limited in scope. So parasympathetic is limited in scope. Sympathetic regulates skeletal muscle. Let me rephrase that. Sympathetic regulates blood flow within skeletal muscle and the body wall because it could easily access it due to following the smooth muscle of blood vessels. And so why the sympathetic nervous system with its alpha receptors and its beta receptors and epinephrine and norepinephrine, why it's regulating the smooth muscle or the smooth muscle within the arteries, vasodilation and constriction, is because of location, location, location. Parasympathetic is regulating the heart because the heart is close to the gut tube. It could get to it more easily than what those neural crest cells of the sympathetic nervous system could. And the same thing for the genitals. It's close to the gut tube. Location, location, location. Preganglion neurons are myelinated because of the proximity to the central nervous system. Those preganglion neurons never left the neural crest region. And so guess what? The glial cells could reach them and therefore myelinate them. Postganglion neurons are not myelinated because they left the neural tube area. They migrated out. They migrated to follow smooth muscles of the blood vessels and the gut. They were no longer near the glial cells. Therefore, they had no ability to be myelinated. Right? I hope that this very simplistic overview of the organization of that autonomic nervous system and its regulatory functions in the developing of the embryo helps to make this all tie together. And I want you to save the link to this video so when you get into A&P2, you can revisit this and kind of remember why the sympathetic and the parasympathetic does what it does during each of those systems that you will encounter in A&P2. And so with that, I say for the last time, in A&P1. I'll catch you on the flip side.